He was right, said Luigi. Do you desire it as ardently as you say? Yes. Well, then, you shall have it. The young girl, much astonished, raised her head to look at him, but his face was so gloomy and terrible that her words froze to her lips. As Luigi spoke thus, he left her. Teresa followed him with her eyes into the darkness as long as she could, and when he had quite disappeared, she went into the house with a sigh. That night a memorable event occurred, due, no doubt, to the imprudence of some servant who had neglected to extinguish the lights. The villa of San Felice took fire in the rooms adjoining the very apartment of the lovely Carmela. Awakened in the night by the light of the flames, she sprang out of bed, wrapped herself in a dressing gown, and attempted to escape by the door, but the corridor by which she hoped to fly was already a prey to the flames. She then returned to her room, calling for help as loudly as she could, when suddenly her window, which was 20 feet from the ground, was opened. A young peasant jumped into the chamber, seized her in his arms, and with superhuman skill and strength conveyed her to the turf of the grass plot, where she fainted. When she recovered, her father was by her side. All the servants surrounded her, offering her assistance. An entire wing of the villa was burnt down, but what of that, as long as Carmela was safe and uninjured? Her preserver was everywhere sought for, but he did not appear. He was inquired after, but no one had seen him. Carmela was greatly troubled that she had not recognized him. As the Count was immensely rich, excepting the danger Carmela had run, and the marvelous manner in which she had escaped, made that appear to him rather a favor of Providence than a real misfortune, the loss occasioned by the conflagration was to him but a trifle. The next day, at the usual hour, the two young peasants were on the borders of the forest. Luigi arrived first. He came toward Teresa in high spirits, and seemed to have completely forgotten the events of the previous evening. The young girl was very pensive, but seeing Luigi so cheerful, she on her part assumed a smiling air, which was natural to her when she was not excited or in a passion. Luigi took her arm beneath his own, and led her to the door of the grotto. Then he paused. The young girl, perceiving that there was something extraordinary, looked at him steadfastly. "Teresa," said Luigi, "yesterday evening you told me you would give all the world to have a costume similar to that of the Count's daughter." "Yes," replied Teresa with astonishment, "but I was mad to utter such a wish." And I replied, "Very well, you shall have it." "Yes," replied the young girl, whose astonishment increased at every word uttered by Luigi, "but of course your reply was only to please me." "I have promised no more than I have given you, Teresa," said Luigi proudly. "Go into the grotto and dress yourself." At these words he drew away the stone, and showed Teresa the grotto, lighted up by 2 wax lights, which burnt on each side of a splendid mirror. On a rustic table, made by Luigi, were spread out the pearl necklace and the diamond pins, and on a chair at the side was laid the rest of the costume. Teresa uttered a cry of joy, and, without inquiring whence this attire came, or even thanking Luigi, darted into the grotto, transformed into a dressing room. Luigi pushed the stone behind her, for on the crest of a small adjacent hill which cut off the view toward Palestrina, he saw a traveler on horseback, stopping a moment, as if uncertain of his road, and thus presenting against the blue sky that perfect outline which is peculiar to distant objects in southern climes. When he saw Luigi, he put his horse into a gallop and advanced toward him. Luigi was not mistaken. The traveler, who was going from Palestrina to Tivoli, had mistaken his way. The young man directed him, but as at a distance of 1/4 of a mile the road again divided into 3 ways, and on reaching these the traveler might again stray from his route, he begged Luigi to be his guide. Luigi threw his cloak on the ground, placed his carbine on his shoulder, and freed from his heavy covering, preceded the traveler with the rapid step of a mountaineer, which a horse can scarcely keep up with. In 10 minutes Luigi and the traveler reached the crossroads. On arriving there, with an air as majestic as that of an emperor, he stretched his hand towards that one of the roads which the traveler was to follow. "That is your road, Excellency, and now you cannot again mistake." "And here is your recompense," said the traveler, offering the young herdsman some small pieces of money. Thank you, said Luigi, drawing back his hand. I render a service, I do not sell it. Well, replied the traveler, who seemed used to this difference between the servility of a man of the cities and the pride of the mountaineer. If you refuse wages, you will, perhaps, accept a gift. Yes, that is another thing. Then, said the traveler, take these 2 Venetian sequins and give them to your bride, to make herself a pair of earrings. And then do you take this poniard, said the young herdsman, you will not find one better carved between Albano and Civita Castellana. I accept it, answered the traveler, but then the obligation will be on my side, for this poniard is worth more than 2 sequins. For a dealer perhaps, but for me, who engraved it myself, it is hardly worth a piaster. What is your name? Inquired the traveler. Luigi Vampa, replied the shepherd, with the same air as he would have replied, Alexander, king of Macedon. And yours? I, said the traveler, am called Sinbad the sailor. Franz d'Epinay started with surprise. Sinbad the sailor, he said. Yes, replied the narrator, that was the name which the traveler gave to Vampa as his own. Well, and what may you have to say against this name? Inquired Albert. It is a very pretty name, and the adventures of the gentleman of that name amused me very much in my youth, I must confess. Franz said no more. The name of Sinbad the sailor, as may well be supposed, awakened in him a world of recollections, as had the name of the Count of Monte Cristo on the previous evening. Proceed, said he to the host. Vampa put the 2 sequins haughtily into his pocket, and slowly returned by the way he had gone. As he came within 200 or 300 paces of the grotto, he thought he heard a cry. He listened to know whence this sound could proceed. A moment afterwards he thought he heard his own name pronounced distinctly. The cry proceeded from the grotto. He bounded like a chamois, cocking his carbine as he went, and in a moment reached the summit of a hill opposite to that on which he had perceived the traveler. Three cries for help came more distinctly to his ear. He cast his eyes around him and saw a man carrying off Teresa, as Nessus, the centaur, carried Deianira. This man, who was hastening towards the wood, was already 3/4 of the way on the road from the grotto to the forest. Vampa measured the distance. The man was at least 200 paces in advance of him, and there was not a chance of overtaking him. The young shepherd stopped, as if his feet had been rooted to the ground. Then he put the butt of his carbine to his shoulder, took aim at the ravisher, followed him for a second in his track, and then fired. The ravisher stopped suddenly, his knees bent under him, and he fell with Teresa in his arms. The young girl rose instantly, but the man lay on the earth struggling in the agonies of death. Vampa then rushed towards Teresa, for at 10 paces from the dying man her legs had failed her, and she had dropped on her knees, so that the young man feared that the ball that had brought down his enemy, had also wounded his betrothed. Fortunately, she was unscathed, and it was fright alone that had overcome Teresa. When Luigi had assured himself that she was safe and unharmed, he turned towards the wounded man. He had just expired, with clenched hands, his mouth in a spasm of agony, and his hair on end in the sweat of death. His eyes remained open and menacing. Vampa approached the corpse, and recognized Cucumetto. From the day on which the bandit had been saved by the 2 young peasants, he had been enamored of Teresa, and had sworn she should be his. From that time he had watched them, and profiting by the moment when her lover had left her alone, had carried her off, and believed he at length had her in his power, when the ball, directed by the unerring skill of the young herdsman, had pierced his heart.